Marcy. Warm greetings from Arlington, Virginia and Washington, D.C., where the delicate cherry blossoms and other splendid signs of spring are in stark contrast to the mega tragedy unfolding in Ukraine, and of course, in other trouble spots in our turbulent world. My name is Sherry Mueller, and it is my privilege to serve as the president of the Public Diplomacy Council. And it's also my privilege to welcome each and every one of you to this webinar, this First Monday Forum. The First Monday Forum is jointly sponsored, and this is the last time we will be saying this, by the Public Diplomacy Association of America, the Public Diplomacy Council, and the USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy. By the next First Monday Forum, the Public Diplomacy Association and the Public Diplomacy Council will have joined forces, merged our membership, merged our resources to become the Public Diplomacy Council of America. I want to say hats off to Joel Fishman, the president of the Public Diplomacy Council, Public Diplomacy Association of America, the members of the Joint Oversight Committee, and all of the many volunteers who have worked for the last 3 years to make this merger come to fruition, a needed merger and one I think that will strengthen our field. Also want to say a thank you to our tech hosts today that make these Zoom webinars possible. Marcy Falk-Bedos is the PDC Hans Tom Tuck Fellow, and she is our primary tech host. Rising professional Emily Fennell is our backup tech host, and they remind me to remind you to please put your questions in the Q&A box, and any tech issues you have to deal with, please put in the chat box. Now, our program today reprises a program from April 2017, First Monday Forum, where we looked at trends unfolding in the curricula of foreign affairs schools, or our APSIA schools, Associated Professional Schools of International Affairs, and what the implications of those trends were for our field of public diplomacy. I'm grateful to our distinguished and geographically diverse panelists today, and also to Ambassador Wayne and Bruce Gregory for being online and posing the first questions. I'm going to introduce, in just 1 minute, Mike Schneider, or I'm going to hand over the microphone to Dr. Mike Schneider, who is ideally suited to be our moderator, who has conceptualized the unfolding of this particular First Monday Forum. And Mike has, of course, a distinguished career in the Foreign Service combined with academic teaching and administration for the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. So it's a great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Mike Schneider.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and welcome everybody. It's a distinct honor for me to be here with you today, and I'd like to introduce a very accomplished and creative panel of leaders in the field who will help give us some better ideas of how academia and the world of statecraft or transnational engagement, civil society organizations communicate, train individuals at the graduate level to go into the professions and have a better understanding of what we call the public dimension of international affairs, which I'll touch upon briefly. But first, I'd like to very briefly introduce our panelists and express our appreciation for your taking part in this discussion. Individuals who are interested can go to the website, the webinar advertisement for the program, and read their biographies, which are fascinating. All of our panelists combine the world of academia with other professional experiences in the public sector and public domain. First, Dean David Van Slyke, as Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. David brings a wealth of creative administrative experience and expertise in public-private partnerships, public sector contracting, contract management, public and nonprofit management, and policy implementation. Note my emphasis on the public elements of Dean Van Slyke's work. As dean, he oversees an unusual mix of public policy, public administration, and international affairs programs for both graduate and undergraduate students, and also supervises the social science departments at Syracuse University, which are under the Maxwell School, and oversees a number of leading research institutes, notably the Moynihan Institute of Global Affairs, which was endowed by the Congress to honor the work of the late senator, ambassador, and public intellectual. David's also been very active in a number of US government and private sector professional organizations that bring together individuals from the different fields of government, business, research, and public participation. Mike Schroeder is the Associate Dean for Graduate Education at the School of International Service of American University. My alma mater, Sherry's alma mater, Bruce Gregory's alma mater, probably others in the audience, all studied at AU and benefited from the work at SIS. Mike has the broad responsibility every day of making sure the array of research and study programs, the curriculum development, the cross-departmental cooperation, the 1,000,001 daily and decisions that have to be made to help the graduate students and the undergraduates at SIS flourish in their research and their studies and prepare for careers in international affairs, which is why SIS is one of the leading international affairs schools. Tara Sonenshine has long experience in the Washington scene in the public sector, dating back to her work as a contributing editor for Newsweek magazine, and as one of the senior people, the key individuals working with Nightline and the original Nightline, and Ted Koppel's original involvement in keeping us current with the hostage crisis of '79. And of course, Ms. Sonenshine was the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in the first Obama administration. So she combines the work in media and the leadership in media with leadership in public diplomacy, and has an array of contacts and teaching experience at GW, at the Elliott School, and at SMPR, and has worked with Brookings in the International Crisis Group. As senior advisor to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Ms. Sonenshine is charged with refocusing and I think re-emphasizing public diplomacy among the many programs at the Fletcher School. We all know the Fletcher School as the manager of the Edward R. and the host, the sponsor of the Edward R. Murrow program and its archives, host of the Senior Public Diplomacy Officer, who was annually the recipient of the Murrow Award for Excellence in Public Diplomacy. So Fletcher was a pioneer in developing the concept of public diplomacy and public education. And it's a good sign from my vantage to see Tara assigned to bring that program even more back to life and important. And finally, Robert Banks has firsthand experience and extensive academic experience as well in the field. Bob joined the Foreign Service in '83 and served as PD practitioner with assignments in Germany and Cyprus, Korea, Nicaragua, and Argentina, and domestic assignments in the Department of State as chair of the faculty of Marine Corps War College in Quantico, where he taught regional studies, and as a U.S. public diplomat in residence at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. USC was the first to start a school or program for public diplomacy, followed, I have to say, as a good patriot of Maxwell, by the Maxwell School's partnership with the Newhouse School. And Bob has pioneered the field. He, after retirement from the Foreign Service, taught as an adjunct professor at the MA of PD program at the USC, and is currently a clinical associate professor of public diplomacy at the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, a CPD faculty fellow and director of the MA PD program at USC. So a wonderful group of leaders in public diplomacy to help us consider what more might be needed to prepare rising professionals for careers in international affairs, with special awareness of the public dimension. By the way, thanks to Bruce Gregory for setting out the concept in the first place. I think I can't say that I'm historically precise, but I credit Bruce. Probably you can tell us, Bruce, from your work with the Defense Science Board in developing this idea. It's a concept that goes beyond public diplomacy, if you will, because I think the underlying assumptions are that nothing happens anymore in the world today, in world affairs, I think even domestic or international affairs, without that public dimension being one of the key elements, a key dimension. It's public opinion, of course. It's social media. It's the underlying social values, the culture, the political culture, the economic culture, if you will, of societies, of transnational issues. It's the communications dynamics. All of these are elements in what we call the public dimension of international affairs. It's not an easy concept to encompass, but it's one that I believe is increasingly important for all of us to understand as decisions become even more shaped by publics, civil society included, or as decision makers in a whole range of political situations seek either to respond, to shape, to anticipate, to get ahead, to control, even to repress the public engagement in issues that they're dealing with. So from my standpoint, it's an encyclopedic concept that's very important to understand. And this is why, with Sherry's leadership, we've decided to come together and talk a little bit more about how graduate programs currently now and might in the future do even more to prepare students, whether they go into public diplomacy and statecraft or communications in the NGO world, how we prepare them to understand and factor in and deal with on both sides of the policy equation when choices are being made of different options, when choices are made about how to communicate those options and pursue them and support them and advocate for them, when people evaluate, assess the reactions and the likelihood of certain outcomes. So I'm going to turn the floor over and ask Dean Van Slyke to start us off. What about the Maxwell's program and how you deal with this public dimension and train our students, graduate students particularly, for involvement?
Mike, thank you so much. And let me just say what an honor it is to be here today. As Mike said, I'm David Van Slyke, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the Maxwell School. And you know, when we start off this, I mean, it's just interesting. We're seeing this play out right now. If we think about how different leaders communicate to their nations, we can begin with what I think we might conclude is an example of successful communications by Ukraine over the last few weeks, and how an overpowered state has managed to make the implications of war on the ground evident to the world, to be able to increase support and actual war-making material and rebuff the Russian narrative. President Zelensky has done, I think, a strong job of communicating to different audiences using a range of mediums, props, and data to present information that's accessible, motivating, and characteristic of a wartime leader. In contrast, just a few years ago, we might have thought about David Cameron's Remain campaign, which was not quite as successful at effectively mobilizing the public to understand what was at stake in Brexit, and thus voting and to vote to remain. I think both are examples of the importance of communication surrounding foreign policy. At Maxwell, we train our students in the Public Diplomacy and Global Communications program to be effective communicators, with an emphasis on presentations and policy writing, so that analysts can effectively influence policymakers. You know, Maxwell has an integrated curriculum that prepares its graduate students for diverse fields of endeavor, broadly included in the study, research, and tradecraft in diverse elements of international affairs. And our graduate program in public administration and international affairs seeks to prepare those students for a world in which social media and electronic communications are playing an ever-growing role. To do so, we look to foster diverse and collaborative problem solvers who can develop innovative solutions to move people, policies, and communities forward. This means being able to understand how publics perceive issues, their hopes and fears, a concern for open communication and community engagement in decisions. And we've long sought talent from both undergraduate education and those with greater experience. And we've benefited, especially recently, from bringing Peace Corps volunteers and Fulbright returnees with practical cross-cultural experiences into our graduate programs. The programs at Maxwell benefit from being co-located. As Dr. Schneider said, Maxwell is public affairs, international affairs, and all the social sciences, all under one school complex. And by being able to draw on the social sciences, it's an unusual mix in graduate education that really helps individuals as they head into careers in international affairs, be able to gain insights from diverse perspectives. The program that we run also represents an integration of policy, governance, and international relations. And we think this helps IR students think about the international and transnational dimensions of issues, and specifically how NGOs, international governmental organizations, governmental agencies, and private firms might consider from a decision-making vantage. This kind of cross-fertilization of viewpoints is all the more needed in today's highly compartmentalized world, but a world in which governance is more international, intergovernmental, interjurisdictional, and cross-sectoral in nature. Being able to work across traditional sector and organizational boundaries is critical for the important work of governance. Now, one of the things that we've done is we've made a significant investment and have a growing presence in Washington, D.C., including our ongoing partnership with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where we're co-located. And I think one of the strengths that we hear from our alums is the blend of the academic experience, but also being in a policy relevant think tank. And those endeavors include public diplomacy as one of several different fields of concentration. It's that emphasis that's really on experiential learning. How do we create these kind of individually mentored internships in the US and abroad, and also help our graduate students broaden their awareness of diverse forces at play in world affairs? Part of what we've tried to do in our newly reformulated master's program in public diplomacy and global communications with the Newhouse School of Communications really relates to the diverse interests of graduate students in careers in diplomacy, development, strategic communications, and international exchanges. And again, we see that this is not only an area where government has historically been involved, but as governance has changed, we see many more multilateral organizations, private firms, NGOs, all with different goals and opportunities. If we think just about some private firms and as well as some multilateral organizations, we might think about it, the predecessor to ESG, which was corporate social responsibility, and how different organizations have thought about this in terms of commercial design, thinking about it from a national security policy making, to how we now see many firms and organizations engage in international marketing, public affairs consulting, issue advocacy, both here in the United States and abroad. And so one of the things that we're trying to get our students to is to gain more practical communication skills. And that's through both courses and internships, special workshops, but also where they can focus on regional interests, draw on different courses across the social sciences, and become multilingual, of course, as many of you are on this call. The program that we have allows graduate students to be able to draw on a broad range of courses. And I think we'll probably talk about what some of those are in just a few minutes. But it's also how to build those skills specifically at the intersection of different platforms and mediums, thinking about information campaign management, audience definition and understanding, and the kind of long-term educational and cultural exchanges that can actually help to promote cross-cultural understanding. So Mike, thanks so much for the invitation to be a part of this panel and for allowing me to talk just a few minutes about the Maxwell School.
Many thanks, David. Mike Schroeder, how to pick up on the SIS approach to preparing graduate students for careers internationally?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the Public Policy Council and Sherry and Marcy and everybody for letting me participate today. It's really a bit humbling to be with such an impressive panel. And it's been a terrific opportunity for me to dive into one area of the school and just learn a little bit more from my colleagues, including Ambassador Wayne, who he and I have worked closely the last few months. And I'm both thrilled and nervous to see him on this call. So we'll see how well I can do. I think I echo a lot of what Dean Van Slyke mentioned in terms of some of the guiding principles and the mission of our courses and our programs tied to public diplomacy. What I'll try to do is maybe give you a taste of what it looks like at the operational level. As the Associate Dean, my job is to make sure that we deliver the curriculum, that we attract students into courses related to public diplomacy, and that I try to empower the faculty who are designing the curriculum and doing the recruiting. And so I think that gives me kind of a very sort of unique perspective on this really exciting field that is really contributing to the long-term professional success of so many of our graduates, many of whom, again, are very appreciative of the work of Dr. Miller and Dr. Wayne, or Ambassador Wayne, to support them. So at SIS, at American University School of International Service, there are actually plenty of opportunities for students to develop sort of skills and baseline expertise in public diplomacy. We have weekend-long sort of intensive skills institutes where students really hone in on a very sort of specific skill or area of public or cultural diplomacy, some of them, again, taught by people on this call. We have courses such as our capstone practicum courses. I think Dr. Mueller teaches one related to public diplomacy where students are in teams and work to deliver a deliverable for a real-world client in this field. We have, of course, a number of other courses on public and cultural diplomacy taught by Ambassador Wayne, among others. And our intercultural and international communications program still has public diplomacy as one of its designated concentrations, as well as a lot of students in the US foreign policy, diplomatic sort of concentration track, really sort of focusing in on this area. And of course, in most of our other programs, and we have a big portfolio of about 17 programs, students can kind of self-design a concentration, and I can assure you that they often do pick courses inside public diplomacy to help sort of round those things out, regardless of whether they're in the development or the security or the conflict resolution field, among others. Of course, it is sort of most pronounced again in this intercultural and international communication program, which we are really, we've always been really proud of because it's really baked into our DNA. It was really the first program of its kind and remains, to my mind, a leader and an innovator in the field, making major changes as late as last year. It's a program with kind of a dual focus on culture and communication, and examines the sort of geopolitical, the technological, the economic, and the cultural relations, not just among governments, but also among peoples and societies and nations. And so not surprisingly, a lot of the courses that they schedule, as well as the ones that Ambassador Wayne teaches for our US foreign policy program, among others, cover a whole range of issues. And a lot of them, I think, have been covered by Dean Van Slyke, so I won't repeat them, but everything from measuring public opinion to really knowing who are the stakeholders and the audiences, to thinking very systematically about the impact of public diplomacy programs. And again, I think these are increasingly driven by what we know the 21st century international affairs workforce wants, right? For better or worse, they want people who can measure impact or at least think systematically about it. There's a lot of the courses focus on topics such as, cultural diplomacy and the broader sort of cultural context, and doing an analysis of that, as well as, of course, navigating those cultural contexts. And of course, as a professional school, it's very much got to be not just about what students know, but what they can do. And so there's a lot of applied learning opportunities, practical exercises from writing and communicating policy and policy recommendations to sort of simulations and all sorts of other what we call experiential opportunities, both inside the classroom and often through their professional experience requirements, their internships, their jobs, and other sort of cool programming co-curricular that we bring around it. To give you a sense of what this looks like on the ground, I would say demand for enrollments in these courses is actually very strong. It's not that every one of them is always fully enrolled, and I think there probably is untapped demand out there. And the students in these classes, and Ambassador Wayne's probably, if he jumps on, can give you a much better sense of who is in his classes. But my sense is it's a lot of students interested in public diplomacy specifically, going directly into this field. But there are also a lot of students interested in the Foreign Service. I'd say the plurality of our students probably still want to go into the Foreign Service, or who want to work in nonprofits, and even increasing the private sector, knows they need this sort of understanding of the public dimension and communicating to broad public audiences in their work. And so not surprisingly, these students who are self-selecting into these courses and understand the value of these courses are benefiting from these courses. And in fact, as I was preparing for this, I talked to Ambassador Wayne, who had just shared with me that a couple of his students had written him to tell him that as a result of the work they'd done in his course and others, not only did it help them navigate the Foreign Service exam, but once they actually got started on the job, they could contribute on day one. And my own view of graduate education is, while we talk a lot about in the long run training the leaders of tomorrow who will be in senior positions, they're here for 2 years. I don't think then, while that's inspirational, I think our job is to make sure that our students, especially ones who come from backgrounds that aren't super privileged, that don't have access to these elite networks, our job is to make sure that they are trained so that they are competitive for the best jobs and the jobs that they want. And then on day one, that they can contribute in those jobs in a way that gets them noticed, and that these agencies and organizations invest in them. And then they start rising the ranks into those more senior roles. And I think there you're really starting to see a lot of these skills and expertise that they're picking up in these public diplomacy courses pay off. And maybe if Marcy can follow up later on and tell me, since she probably can speak directly to these issues. So I think that really, I think this sort of leads to my sort of challenge, I guess, if I'm thinking it through and thinking about the future. It clearly brings public diplomacy a lot of value to these APSIA schools. It's attracting students, it's training them well, and most importantly, it's serving them well after they graduate. But I actually think that too many students don't understand the potential benefits of public diplomacy, whether that's a weekend skills institute to just get them some basic familiarity, through to a full 3-credit course where they're going to dive a little deeper, through to a concentration, and so on and so forth. And these are often very, I think, just practical impediments to expanding interest and demand and helping more of our APSIO student body understand the value. Part of it is quite simply the nature of the way I've watched too many students plan their graduate and postgraduate life. Despite really heroic efforts by the faculty, program administrators, mentors, and alumni, career services staff, many students really delay understanding what skills and expertise are going to be valued in the jobs they want, including Foreign Service officers. And by the time they do, often as they're planning their final semester, it's too late for them to take a course. That course is full. They have to finish other requirements. And so I think one of the challenges is, again, making sure that they understand this value as early on in the process as possible, ideally before they've even started in the program, when they're still trying to figure out what grad school is going to look like and how that 2-year foundation is then going to be a launch pad for their broader careers. And the second thing, and this is an issue I think with probably a lot of APSIA schools, we offer a ton of courses. We just have a lot of selection. It's that classic paradox of choice. And so the number of times I have heard a student say, I would love to take a public diplomacy class. It's my 4th choice this year, and they can only take 3 courses. And so I think for a lot of students, they somewhat see it, but they're convinced for whatever reason that they need to take a 3rd terrorism class rather than sort of expanding their boundaries and getting students to think more broadly and earlier on. And again, I think this sort of falls into the sort of 3rd sort of challenge to make sure that students really understand the benefits of getting an understanding of this field, which is the plurality of our students really still are interested in fields like security and development, and too few of them see public diplomacy as core, even as it's becoming core to the work that, frankly, especially in their first years, they're going to be doing, the work they'll be tasked to do. And so I think those are sort of the 3 challenges, right? I think there's this potential for it to be a huge component, much bigger than it is now, of the APSIA school course offerings, of how students go through their graduate education. But I think it's about creating awareness and helping students understand why it should be a top priority. I do have very quickly a couple thoughts from my own perch. I will leave it to the experts here to sort of build them out. I'm really not convinced that it's just a matter of offering more courses or requiring every student to take the course. I think that's a tough sell to the faculty as a whole when there's a lot of other skills that my faculty also believe everyone should take. But I do think that there are some really quite low-hanging fruit that would really, I think, enhance the ability of students to see this value. Number one, and I will call out Tony by name here, I think prominent practitioners is a really helpful way. Students want to take Tony's courses, and especially if they've taken his diplomatic practice course. I mean, and so I think just having his name, prominent practitioners, people who have been in the jobs that these students aspire to, and seeing that he's teaching this course, I think is going to draw more students. So prominent practitioners in these roles, I think, is really important. Secondly, I think this biggest group is, again, this group of aspiring foreign service officers. And that earlier on in their sort of career, whether they're Wrangell Fellows knowing they're going to foreign service or Pickerings, or whether they're students who just aspire to take the exam and go the more traditional route, I think it's really important that when there are career panels, when there are alumni events, that those, and when faculty who are themselves foreign service officers really stress this public diplomacy. I think this message has to be reiterated time and again so that every student who aspires to be a foreign service officer or is even considering it sees a public diplomacy course as critical to both navigating the foreign service entrance process, but also, again, understands why this will be critical to their success in their early posts. And again, I think the sort of fourth option is, again, the role, and I'll call it Sherry here, is the role of practica courses. Capstone courses that we teach, Practica in particular, all of our students need to take them, but it's a much more limited set of course offerings. And so students start digging in a little deeper into the individual offerings. They start understanding better the skills that each capstone is going to offer. And so I think by offering capstones with public diplomacy clients, or the minimum that public diplomacy or that public dimension is a portion of the capstone practicum experience, I think you're going to see a lot of students who might otherwise not get experience in that area actually take that course and start to understand it and see its value, and then they can sort of build on it later in their life. So I realize not quite the sort of deep conceptual, but I think that sort of might give you some taste of kind of on the ground where I see both this in tremendous value and potentially just some of the small disconnects. And I really think they're small. These are not giant hurdles that if we can find a way around, I think you can really drive public diplomacy into the center of APSIA life. And that would be really cool.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Tara, you've seen it from various vantages. Talk to us about your new incarnation and how you're looking at the skills needed, the programs available, how Fletcher is starting to work in the realm of preparing individuals for public diplomacy or the public element of international engagement.
Well, thank you, Mike, and my co-panelists. A special shout out to Sherry and to Nicholas Cole and Bruce Gregory for the contributions you don't even yet know you're making to my forthcoming syllabus. I'll be teaching in the fall Intro to Public Diplomacy, but I've spent the last few months around Fletcher giving one overview on public diplomacy, and I'll be doing something next week on working in public diplomacy. Within a few weeks of arriving on campus, we were already doing a Fletcher program with the State Department honoring Lori Nierenberg for her work and giving her the Excellence in Public Diplomacy Award. So that was an Edward R. Murrow Fletcher State combination, which gave me a chance to chat with the dean at length about public diplomacy, Dean Kite, Dean Cunningham, who's at the Tisch College, and some of the others. And what I'll do in the interest of time is narrow it down to three pillars of public diplomacy at the graduate level, and then probably yield back some of my time because one of the lodestars is interactive conversation. And the reason I don't want to speak too long at you is because one of the principles of public diplomacy, as we all know, is that it be multi-directional. And so I think in my course, there will be little of the traditional presentation and historical timeline, and much more, drawing people into the conversation. So I'd say the three pillars that we can talk about in more detail. One is the multidisciplinary nature of teaching public diplomacy at the graduate level, by which I mean the dean is a climate expert, and that's one facet of her interests. Others on the campus are interested in diplomatic history. I've talked with the economists who put together EconoFacts. And what I'm struck by is that public diplomacy in the new age will be reflective of many disciplines: law, diplomacy, refugees, humanitarian, and in that way reflective of what I am going to call writ large the de-emphasis on militarization of our foreign policy. And although public diplomacy has been a bit protected from that by its inclusion of Joe Nye's soft power, by smart power, I think writ large our foreign policy at times has been driven a great deal by defense, and now we see the humanitarian, climate, and other aspects. The second lodestar after multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, conversational approach would be the internationalization of the graduate work. Fletcher is 50% students from the United States and 50% international. So that already speaks volumes about the public diplomacy space. USC has been by far one of the pioneers in studying Chinese public diplomacy, Russian public diplomacy, diplomacy in Qatar, in expos. So I hope to introduce that in order to be responsive and reflective of the international chords in the public diplomacy graduate education. And the last I would say is the digital aspect of public diplomacy, which is to say that the last 2 years of COVID have forced all of us onto Zoom. And if there's one thing we take from that in public diplomacy, it'll be the hybrid nature of programming. We couldn't get Lori Nierenberg to campus, but we were able to give her the award because she joined us via Zoom. And I think to throw all that away, particularly given social media and digital trends, would be a mistake. So for me, in closing, I would say the graduate level interdisciplinary approaches to it, the international components and the digital components are all going to be important. One last thing, when I was at the State Department, I was quite concerned about the PD track, about FSI, and about the morale issues. And I think those are things that we will have to address. So I'll yield back some of my time to the panel and look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Tara. We'll make sure you have ample to reclaim some of that time. Ambassador Wayne, how about a question and your own perspective?
Well, as Tara and the other speakers were sort of indicating, PD is rapidly evolving. And both the knowledge span and the skills that are needed are very much evolving with that for PD officers. So I'd be interested to hear how people think they have evolved even over the past 3 or 4 years. And as David mentioned to begin with, they're changing right now with Ukraine's practice. So I'd like to hear how people have thought about that and how they're thinking of putting that into their curriculum and the courses they're teaching.
The evolution of the field or the evolution of the demands on the field, or both?
No, I think it's the evolution of the skills you need to be a successful public diplomacy officer and to carry out a successful public diplomacy program. I mean, and the other aspect of it is that line between domestic and international has disappeared.
Sure.
In so many ways. So I'm giving you a hint, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about how that should be integrated. Thanks.
Great. Your question leads me to reintroduce Bob Banks. I apologize for not bringing you in as a panelist, Bob, but why don't you expose us to the programs and the expertise that USC formulates, and I think Earl's Tony's question is a perfect lead-in for you.
Well, thank you, Mike, and good morning from Southern California. And thanks to the council and to Sherry in particular for giving me the opportunity to talk today about USC's MPD program. I'll divide my remarks into 4 parts. I'll introduce the general outlines of our program. Second, I'll describe our student learning objectives. And I'll move on to talk about the specific knowledge and skills that we want to impart to our students. And last, I'll mention a few of the features of the program that I think add tremendous value to the student learning experience here. Regarding the program itself, when students graduate from USC's Master of Public Diplomacy program, they have an MPD degree, that is a master's degree specifically and only in public diplomacy. In other words, it's not a field or a concentration. The program is situated in the Communications School within the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. The degree requires 32 credits, of which 16 are core and 16 are elective. The program is a small one. We admit around 20 to 25 students a year, which I think is an advantage for us in terms of our getting to know our students well and vice versa. Our overall goal is to provide our students a professional foundation for a career at the intersection of communications and foreign affairs. The program began in 2005 as a joint effort between IR and the Annenberg School. And even though we still have IR professors and practitioners who teach in the program, that collaboration no longer formally exists. Nonetheless, it's reflected in the program's learning objectives. Let me go through these now. First of all, we'd like our students to understand public diplomacy's role, as many speakers have already commented, the role of public engagement within today's broader foreign policy and national security framework. We see PD as an essential tool for international actors at the nexus of communications and foreign affairs. Second, we want our students to be exposed to a broad range of international issues and to introduce communication-based approaches to addressing those issues. In other words, to suggest the centrality of communications in the management of foreign relations today. But we also want our students grounded in reality. We want them to understand both the capabilities and the limits of public diplomacy in today's affairs. In addition, we want to expose our students to a range of scholarship on public diplomacy, to understand the theoretical foundations of, as well as the historical and comparative approaches to PD. Next, we expect our students to develop an understanding of those global geopolitical megaforces that are changing our world and changing public diplomacy, particularly in areas such as innovation in and digitization of public diplomacy. We also think it's important for our students to be familiar with 2 of the central pillars of public diplomacy, exchanges and cultural programming, as well as some of its specialized thematic concerns and applications in areas like trade, regional studies, branding, soft power, and city diplomacy. And lastly, we want to deepen our students' comfort level with living, working, and practicing PD in a multiracial and multicultural environment. To that end, our program emphasizes a strong mix of international and domestic students. This year, in fact, more than 50% of our applicants came from overseas and from a huge variety of countries: Kazakhstan, Uganda, France, China, Lebanon, UK, Mexico, Japan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Kuwait, Vietnam, India, and Switzerland, etc. And a number of these are applying based on government-provided scholarships. So suggesting the growth of public diplomacy as a field of study and as an activity at the government level. Our program also emphasizes team-based classes. We think public diplomacy is essentially a team-based enterprise. Prior to the pandemic, we provided some funding for an opportunity for international travel. We are continuing the process of trying to de-Americanize our curriculum and incorporate PD practices beyond US borders. And we emphasize the integration of DIA concerns and practices into the curriculum, up to and including creating just this past semester a new class specifically on the topic of race and public diplomacy, which examines the impact of race on public diplomacy, specifically in US foreign policy generally. As I mentioned earlier, overall, our goal is to provide a professional foundation for a career at the intersection of communications and foreign affairs by building skills that we think will serve as preparation for the workplace. The particular knowledge and skills we think are important to incorporate focus on 3 streams of courses: foundational and conceptual, content delivery, content creation and delivery, strategy, and analytics. In particular, we stress understanding the concepts of strategic planning in devising short and long-term PD campaigns, providing a firm understanding of the current theory and practice of public diplomacy evaluation. In fact, I teach a core class in PD evaluation. 3, developing core competencies for operating comfortably in the digital space in such areas as data insights, web analytics, multi-platform content creation, digital storytelling, and beyond into artificial intelligence and virtual reality. In short, to develop skills of information statecraft. And lastly, to help our students hone their skills in public speaking, oral presentation, and writing. Armed with these skills, our students typically get jobs in one of the following areas: in government, both federal, state, and local, international and regional organizations, the private sector, the nonprofit world, NGOs, CSOs, and foundations, in universities, and in cultural and media institutions. A number have also gone on to get their PhDs in communication. And to wrap up my remarks, I'd like to mention a few MPD features of note that I think enhance the learning experience here at USC. They are, first, our institutional affiliations. Our partner institution here at USC is the Center on Public Diplomacy, which I believe is the world's leading resource for information, training, research, and publication about PD. It's a tremendous asset for us to be co-located with the CPD. We also have an affiliation with the Department of State. Every 2 years, we host an active duty FSO who teaches, does research, and acts as a liaison between our students and the department. State calls them visiting fellows. We call them public diplomats in residence. And every year we host a Canadian Fulbright Scholar in Residence. Last year's Fulbrighter was an expert in international education as a component of foreign policy. Another important feature of our program is a strong student association called the Society of Public Diplomats. Each year, the students publish the world's only student-run PD journal called Public Diplomacy Magazine. The topic of this year's edition will be race and diversity in public diplomacy. And the students also mount an annual PD conference, usually a half-day exercise. And lastly, we stress our location here in Los Angeles. We are where we have huge diaspora communities, over 100 consulates, and creative industries with international reach and influence. Now, let me stop there and be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Bob. Tony, did you want to follow up on the question that you had, or should I turn to somebody else?
Well, just to reiterate, to get it started, thanks very much, Bob. And I had the great pleasure of working with Bob in Argentina when he was still in the Foreign Service. And he did a great job, and we had a lot of fun together exploring public diplomacy as it was changing at that moment. It was really starting to evolve. So that goes back again to I think to the question that I have now. My impression is that the skills needed for successful public diplomacy are changing regularly, and the knowledge base is changing regularly as the whole fora in which we digitally interact and we cross between domestic and international subject matter is taking place. So I'd be very interested in hearing from the participants of how they see the way courses being taught is evolving also. Thank you.
David, have any comments on that, on the changing focus of training and courses at school?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. I wasn't sure if you were going to go to Bruce Gregory or Joel Fishman. So I'm happy to wait if you'd like, or jump in right now on that.
Let's respond to Tony, and then I'll ask Bruce for his question.
So I think, as Ambassador Wayne said, I mean, we're seeing this, and we're seeing it driven as much by the faculty as we are the students, right? So given the students' own prior experiences, you know, I think this goes to an earlier question that was in the Q&A. Part of it is about expectations management, right? What am I going to be able to do as soon as I come out of this program? But I think, as Bob was saying, right, part of this is not just the integration of experiential learning, but it's the actual translational relevance of what we're doing on the content side, right? Because classes, as Mike Schroeder was saying before, can be very kind of content heavy. Everyone's a subject matter expert on their small piece. But one of the things that students are really challenging, and of course, as Bob just noted, with a number of his international participants also having funding from, you know, their own governments, they want to know, what can you actually do? Right. And I think part of that is having more of those skill-based sets. So how do we look at web analytics? How do we actually not only understand data analytics, but how do we actually use that to then interpret what we're doing, what's working, under what conditions it's working, to what extent it's reaching a particular audience on a particular issue, and where is it not, right? And so I think, you know, 10 years ago, maybe Bob was doing, you know, PD evaluation in practice, but there weren't many courses like that use the kind of systematic tools of program evaluation and data analysis, and then actually layered onto it, here's how you think about public diplomacy. If I can, Mike, just two more things I want to respond to.
Sure.
I think Bob said this, and I want to go a little bit more granular on it. It's not just the federal government that does this. Right. In part of our challenge about confidence in public institutions is that there's actually a little less confidence in federal agencies and more confidence in your own state and local government. And we've seen some local governments become big employers of individuals who have the kind of public diplomacy skills that can work as a team. So no longer working as an individual, but working as a team and engaging international governments and private sector firms, right? And actually now, how do you become part of that negotiation team? And I think, you know, we see more and more companies, especially multinational organizations or companies that have aspirations of scale and growth into other, you know, international markets, where policy, regulation, and culture play such an important part of how we think about what is going to be a mutually beneficial relationship long-term, instead of simply, you know, another spot market transaction, right? So Mike, I'll stop there, but I think those points and the ambassador's question are highly relevant.
I just want to chime in, Mike.
I don't have much more to add to that. I mean, I think, you know, I know Tony asked the question, but he would also be the one implementing it on our end. So he would be in a much better position to answer us. But I will just sort of reiterate this idea of, and I think Dean Van Slyke just brought this up, you know, our students really do want to be able to do something with what they've learned in the classroom. Again, sometimes not even before they graduate, whether that's in their internships that all of our students are required to fulfill some sort of professional experience requirement. I think the other key area for us where we've made some real strides is in experiential learning. Again, those practicum courses that Dr. Mueller teaches and others, where again, students, even before they graduate, have the benefit of having a seasoned practitioner be sort of providing instruction on the class, even as they are delivering something for a public diplomacy client or a public diplomacy deliverable for a non-public diplomacy client. And I think students, I will say this is in some ways the sweet spot, because students are getting skills that they need. They are learning critical thinking. They are learning communication skills, and they love it. I mean, this is a class that our students we built these practica courses, and it really, one of my colleagues is one, she deserves much of the credit here, we built them about 10 years ago. We figured about half the students would take these courses, the other half would do more traditional research papers, and we way overshot the mark. I think it's 80%, and we end up literally turning down students every year because we just don't have enough slots. But I think this is another opportunity to bring those public diplomacy skills that are in demand. I will leave to the experts to decide what we'll take away from Zelensky's sort of masterful use of communication, including, I believe he was on the Golden Globes last night, or the Music Awards. I mean, really talk about working every platform available.
Yeah, right. He misses no.
It was remarkable.
Yeah, right. But I think you touched on something that's very important for this generation of students, particularly. They want to get their hands into it. They want to do things. And that's why they're so responsive to the experiential learning that all these schools offer. And they have sensed already that even the most noble, highly idealistic NGO will say, what can you do for us? Actually, what skills? Can you do SAS or can you do Python? Can you do R? These are the entry gateways. But that will lead to another question later on, I'm hoping, about beyond doing, there's that level of understanding that's so important. Tara, do you want to add comments?
I would just add, for my course, journalism, because I come from a broadcast and print background, that writing skills and being able, every student in my class will have to write an op-ed and try to place it either locally or on campus, but they'll need to go through the experience of putting their ideas into 750 words. They will have to do press releases. They will have to do social media. Each person will have to do the equivalent of a Facebook posting that an embassy might do, an introductory video that an ambassador might do. So it really has to be doing and creatively doing. If they want to do something with food and diplomacy, they'll need to pick music and diplomacy, some area that is a mode of communications and a means of expression that takes into account the culture of the audience. Everything will begin with, who are you speaking to? What is your goal in your communications, and how will you know if you've hit the mark, the M&E skills that are required to know that your feedback loop, that your number of participants, the number of hits, the impact on policy, the legislative changes. There will be a series of steps that ensure that you have somehow reached the goals you've set out to reach.
Aptly put, Tara. You know, for those, a little bit of history, for generations, folks in USIA sort of looked askance at what we call metrics and evaluation these days. The theory being that you can deliver the horse to water, but you can't make them drink, meaning you can deliver messages, you can provide opportunities for interaction and exchange of persons and ideas, but how do you measure what goes on? That's a real challenge. For better or worse, in the digital era, you can measure, and that has some impact on the way people look at achievement. But let's turn to Bruce for your question. Bruce has been so pivotal in our understanding of the field. Bruce, please.
Well, thanks, Mike, and a shout out to Mike and Sherry for putting together a great panel. I guess I'd like to take the discussion to a question about why so few IR departments and schools have concentrations in diplomacy and public diplomacy. On this panel, we have four who've led the way: AU, USC, and a shout out to its Center for Public Diplomacy, the gold standard in an institute in an academic setting, Syracuse, Fletcher. I'd add Georgetown, GW's Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, and Jeff Wiseman's program at DePaul University in Chicago on practitioner diplomacy. But it's a pretty short list. And Donna Oglesby, about 7 years ago, many of you know her, did a survey of some 60 IR departments in this country. And she basically, I think, made a persuasive argument that a lot of what's going on is the economics of universities putting students in seats. This was alluded to earlier about their choices and the plethora of choices they have, and diplomacy doesn't always make the list. So there's that, or is it also based on how American society looks at diplomacy and how it treats other instruments of statecraft, particularly the militarization of our statecraft, and how so many of our diplomatic practitioners are in uniform or in other government departments. So what are the reasons that we only have a handful of schools doing this? And I think you touched on it a bit in your presentations, but could you elaborate on how what you're doing fits in the larger dynamics of the entrepreneurial university and American society?
David, you want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So I want to take a crack at it by first offering an analog. So as Mike Schneider said at the beginning, Maxwell's involved in organizations like APSIA, but on the public affairs side, we're also very involved in an organization called NASPA. NASPA is the National Association of Schools of Public Affairs. And so, for example, AU, the School of Public Affairs, is involved. At USC, it would be the Price School. At George Washington, it would be the Trachtenberg School, and so forth. One of the things, Bruce, to your question is, I don't think we've done a great job of talking about the success of going through programs like ours, right? So here's my analog. When we think about social entrepreneurship, when we think about sort of entrepreneurship, and here we have a number of former government practitioners who were, I might argue, because of your success, entrepreneurial in what you were doing in terms of public diplomacy. Business schools have been very out front in terms of not just delivering a business education, but a business education for those who want to go into government, into nonprofits, into multilateral, into private sector firms. On the public affairs side of the equation, we've done a really poor job of saying anything beyond going to work in government, and maybe a little bit in terms of government consulting or into the nonprofit sector. So when you asked the question, Bruce, why are we not doing more of it? I think we're not promoting the success of it, right? And I think we tend to equate public diplomacy as the ex ante set of antecedents prior to some kind of national security conflict. But how often do we avoid a national security conflict and go back and say, because of successful diplomatic efforts and interventions and these particular strategies, we were able to avoid going into some kind of armed conflict. In the same way, some firms do an outstanding job in terms of talking about, one of the questions in the Q&A section is, well, what kinds of private firms? Well, think about some of the biggest supply chain firms in the world: Apple, Ford, Tesla, General Motors. Think about rare earths and minerals. We don't hear about all the people that are actually practicing and crafting different forms of public diplomacy and the actual ground level implementation of when a firm, a multinational firm, so let's just keep it simple, a US firm acting outside the United States borders of the United States are actually working in these other countries, and all the things that go into public diplomacy. We rarely, if ever, tell those stories. We don't have a lot of great case studies about those stories. And we don't make, I think, to the point that Tara was making earlier, sort of really brand those in a succinct manner that people can get their hands around and say, that's the kind of work I'd love to be involved in, right? And when you think about it, it's the intersection of communication, policy, cross-cultural understanding. There's a lot of reasons to think it's really exciting and interactive, and that there's real mobility from a career perspective, but we haven't done a great job as a subfield, right, of actually telling that story.
And one of the problems, if I can amplify what David is saying, is terminology. We all speak public diplomacy. But even in the course of our conversation, but in a graduate level, I hear international relations, foreign policy, diplomacy training of young leaders. We haven't talked about ethics in diplomacy. Now we're bringing in, rightly so, diversity and inclusion. When you look at the vocabulary and terminology of the US government, from USIA to UCIS to R to now GPA, I would not fault people for being a little confused, especially from other countries, about what the heck we're talking about, because public affairs, public opinion, public diplomacy, we ourselves have to be consistent and clear and good storytellers if the field is going to be good at messaging. So just, I appreciate that point.
Anyone else want to pick up on that? The proliferation of vocabulary and nomenclature is quite striking, isn't it? Please,
I'm happy.
Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy. Again, I don't have a whole lot more to say. I think Dean Van Slyke sort of captured the 30,000 foot point, which is that, you know, I think we have to understand, students need to understand all the career pathways available and all the way that public diplomacy will support a variety of careers, not just again in roles like foreign service and in public diplomacy bureaus, but also in cultural exchange, but also in the private sector, in the big advocacy organizations, which a lot of our students want to participate in. I mean, I think our graduate outcomes at SIS are about 1/3 private sector, 1/3 nonprofit, and 1/3 government now. So I think we just need to do a better job of explaining how these programs and courses will kind of support those. I also think it's an open question, and for me, and I'm fascinated to hear more from the other panelists, whether we need more courses or do we need actual full-blown programs around public diplomacy. I mean, I'm of sort of two minds. In some ways, specialized programs are great. In other ways, I worry that it limits, if students start limiting, self-selecting that they're only going to apply for a smaller number of jobs, and that always concerns me. And so broader is helpful. So I think that, to my mind, is an open question, and certainly one, if I took a new program to my faculty, even one at SIS, where intercultural international communications is a really popular program, I think we'd probably get some pushback. I think the other key area, which I don't think has been mentioned, is undergrad students. Students understand what the field of international affairs looks like in their undergraduate degrees, to the extent that we still pull largely from political science and from international relations departments, that sort of nomenclature, that disconnect between the nomenclature in IR and the big theories of IR and all the value public diplomacy can do as professional training, I think sometimes gets lost. And so making sure that undergraduate programs really make this clear and sort of help seed the demand. I think it's a lot easier to sell provosts and others to build new programs when we're hearing from undergrads, they're hearing that they want more courses on public diplomacy from their undergraduate programs. And I think the other one is probably just a bureaucratic problem, which is, you know, our schools of communication, we have programs that already have some of these. And so it's easy to say, we're just going to break down silos, create new programs that cut across disciplines and across schools. But in some places, those can be real obstacles at a time where, you know, curriculum development, everyone, I think, is open to it. I mean, we're seeing post-pandemic, and we're seeing, you can make the case that there are these, so the changing field of international affairs is creating opportunities for new programs in areas like public diplomacy. But I think they're going to be sort of those institutional challenges. So that's kind of my view of just, I think, some of the reasons why I think we haven't seen as many APSIA schools really kind of lean in the way we might expect, again, given the fact that it is becoming so essential, again, not just to public service, but to broader international service, which is the term we like to use.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to add to it? Sarah, David, please.
So I just want to respond to two things that Mike Schroeder said, which I thought were really helpful. Let me start in reverse order. Why more schools haven't done this? Some of it may be a function of location, and some of it is a function of access to talent pool, and some of it is a function of what other core intellectual assets are on the campus. So at USC, there are a lot of intellectual assets on campus. And while co-production in a collaborative way in universities is never particularly easy, right? Those intellectual assets exist. You know, 2 other programs in DC and in Boston, major metropolitan areas. And in DC, I mean, you know, you look at a program like the one at AU, and there are so many former practitioners who are involved, right? And you know, I mean, it's really an incredible resource. On Mike's first point, I think he's asking exactly the right question. I'll just tell you my personal opinion, which is I'm not in favor of a proliferation of more narrowly defined and highly specialized degree programs, right? At the end of the day, what I want students coming out of all our undergrad and graduate programs is a set of core skills, right? And you'll all laugh because it sounds like a cliche, but you know, how important critical thinking is, how important written, oral, and presentational skills are, how important it is to be able to adapt to uncertainty and incomplete information and ambiguity, the ability to work in teams, the ability to do analysis, right? Look, if you want to have a career in cloud computing management and you want to get a master's in cloud computing management, good for you. That's fantastic. But what's going to happen after the cloud, right? And so again, I'm not trying to say anything pejorative about cloud computing management master's degrees programs, but my real question is, you know, when we think about the kinds of programs, it is thinking about the evolving nature of public diplomacy, right? And as Tara said before, right, part of this is the culture of your audience. So, you know, Mike, if I put you and Bruce and Tony and Bob and Tara and Sherry on the spot and say, you know, tell me when you were doing this in the 1970s and 80s, tell me how you were thinking about all these kind of Instagram, Twitter, WeChat, WhatsApp, right? And you'd be looking at me like, what are you talking about? Because we didn't even have cell phones at that point. And when we did, we were carrying them around in a box that was the size of a shoebox, right? And it cost $1 a minute, right? And so my point is, right, in the evolution and adaptation to changing, you know, protocols, different platforms, new mediums, and the way in which we engage in technology, one of the things is too often government is always involved in technology ex post, after the fact. And when we're involved, government almost always has a regulatory function, right? And sometimes that can be both coercive and adversarial. Very rarely, in fact, too infrequently, is government involved ex ante in the development of new technologies with respect to certain problems that actually government is trying to solve. And I think there are certain places where some of that innovation is happening. You know, my own work on the Defense Business Board, the Defense Innovation Board, is actually doing some of that work in engaging with different subsectors of the broader technology sector. But let's ask ourselves the same question about evolution of communication, and what would be some types of organizations, right, that we should be engaging with now, kind of foreshadowing how we think about communication in the future.
I think if there's one skill today, one trait we can take away to teach our graduates in the graduate program, our students, is curiosity. What we all had even before we had cell phones or Facebook, we were curious. We were interested. And these are young people who are going to have 9, 10, 11 careers. And I think for most of us, we moved from media to think tanks, to nonprofits, to government, because we were constantly curious about the next thing coming or the next idea. And if that is the glue that holds all this together, is that we're curious about what our audience thinks, we're curious about what other nations think of us, we're curious about what individuals on a people-to-people basis think and do, I think we'll be on our way, and the field will be populated by very curious individuals.
That's a great way for us to segue into a couple of remarks that I want to make in conclusion. Thank you so much for really plumbing the depths and giving us exposure to a number of ideas that we all ought to think about some more and continue to think about in the long run. David and Mike and Tara and Bob, the curiosity is an element that should pervade all fields and all disciplines, no matter how technical they are becoming. Just a footnote, the State Department just announced the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, another wrinkle on the communications realm we see evolving so rapidly. I myself am curious as to what that means from an organizational standpoint. What will it include? How much of the Global Engagement Center? How will GPA and public affairs? How will R? How will exchanges even relate to this new bureau's functions? How technical will it be? How will it overlap with what the DoD does or the intelligence community? And so we see evolving in front of us every day new technologies that are bringing the public in various ways into the mix of what we call public diplomacy. Certainly the decision-making process at all levels for all institutions with regard to all issues is far more complex than it was a generation ago. And that's I think, one of the reasons why so many of us believe that public diplomacy encompasses and is so vitally necessary for what is going on in the world around us, to be simple about it. In part, there are questions you've raised about the boxes of academe. What School of Communications, School of Public Affairs, School of International Relations, how they might interact to produce the kinds of qualities that David, you mentioned, and Bob mentioned also for students who graduate from those programs. The need for far more communication, if you will, between and among programs and schools to get a desired outcome is very important. You've also all raised the primacy of the audience and how much more important audiences are. Audiences are a substitute for publics, communities. Community buy-in, community engagement is so much more critically needed in an era where everything is so more specialized, and where specialized means measuring achievement by specialized terms, and that may not be in the interests of the larger society or transnational interests. We see that in so many walks of life. There's a lot of abbreviation also. Someone mentioned the acronyms we live in today. Abbreviation and speed are necessary elements in today's world of technology, but they are also hurdles, barriers, if you will, obstacles, important elements to understand so that we can jump over, if you will, or deal with or integrate the abbreviated world of technology that we're facing. And then finally, there's certainly, coming from your discussions, and a need to balance content and practice, to balance theory and experiential learning. Theory is important. It remains important. It is what looks ahead, far ahead of where we are today, and can integrate the various experiences that we've had. Practice is demanded by undergraduate and graduate students these days. Increasingly, the work world demands practical experience to get started. But I always tell my students, you'll get the job by being able to do the social media management that the older generation can't or won't do. But you don't want to stay there forever. You want to move around, and they do move around. Students move laterally to move vertically. And increasingly, I think academe will be pressed to help students move laterally and vertically by retraining, training and retraining, so that it will become a lifetime or career time necessity, if you will. These are just scratching the surface. We greatly appreciate the good ideas, your involvement, your presentations today. And we hope this is just the beginning of an ongoing dialogue that we all share in terms of how to prepare students practically, theoretically, for the world that they are increasingly having to face, and also by virtue of mention of diversity and ethics and policy making and public performance, how we can help them as citizens as well as technicians or experts in their fields. With that, I want to say thank you very much for your engagement today, and I look forward to future opportunities for us all to share ideas about how we can prepare all of us, especially the next generation, for the challenges they're facing. And Joel, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Mike. And hi, everyone. On behalf of all of us in the Public Diplomacy Association of America, the Public Diplomacy Council, and USC Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy, thank you to all of our panelists, David Van Slyke, Mike Schroeder, Tara Sonenshine, and Bob Banks. And a special thanks to you, Mike and Sherry, for organizing and moderating today's program. I know how much work it was. As Sherry mentioned at the beginning of this program, this is the last program of its kind, first Monday or mid-month, brought to you by PDAA and PDC. On April 15, the two organizations will merge into the Public Diplomacy Council of America. And let me assure you that PDCA will be dedicated to a high level of service to the public diplomacy community, and that high quality programs such as today's will continue. PDCA will be doing a series of deep dives into everything it does, and that will include what PDCA can do for the academic community and hopefully vice versa. With that, I wish everyone well. This has been First Monday.